With the stage set for a confrontation in the waters around Midway Island, Spruance led Enterprise and Hornet, comprising Task Force 16, south. Several days into the journey, Yorktown, the sole capital ship element of Task Force 17, caught up, which then handed overall operational control to Admiral Fletcher. He ordered Task Force 16 to operate 10 miles south of Task Force 17, which on a good day would mean direct visual signals could be made between the carriers, and their screens would be close enough to relay messages should a haze or fog descend. Now, all they had to do was a bit of last-minute practice and a lot of waiting. Then, on the 3rd of June, confirmation from patrol aircraft based at Midway came, stating that the Japanese were indeed inbound, and so the carriers headed southwest into strike positions. The 4th dawned with the wind coming from the southeast, and Yorktown launched a recon patrol to check for any further Japanese Navy forces which potentially might be trying to pincer the island from the north. And then all Spruance could do for a while was listen to a series of radio reports. A Midway search plane confirmed enemy carriers had indeed been spotted, and a little while later it reported that a large number of enemy aircraft were heading to Midway Island. But it took about half an hour for confirmation of the location of the enemy carriers, or at least their estimated location, to actually be reported back. This then prompted a slightly comical scene as multiple officers all tried to grab the ship's one set of measuring dividers. Spruance, after having ensured that no one had managed to stab themselves or someone else with a sharp instrument, strolled past, unrolled his own manoeuvring board, which was blank, ordered the contact report to be read out again, as well as the ranges and bearings from Midway to his ships and from Midway to the enemy. He then sketched out positions and lines of bearing with a pencil, and using his fingers as a pair of dividers, having apparently thought better than to try and prise the ship's set off the winner of the little scrum behind him, he estimated the ranges, determined that his aircraft could indeed hit the enemy, rolled up his board, and then ordered the attack to be launched. This was in keeping with his previous established strategy. He needed to be the first to land a hit. Regardless of overall aircraft numbers, the Japanese Navy could, after all, trade with him hull for hull and come out ahead. And that was a real possibility if everything was equal. So to stack the deck in his favour, Spruance aimed to remove some of the enemy flight decks first. Any subsequent exchanges would therefore be easier to defend against due to fewer enemy aircraft, and then if circumstances allowed it, it would also be easier for the US aircraft to hit the Japanese with a follow-up attack using their surviving aircraft if there were fewer carriers left to oppose them, and therefore a smaller combat air patrol. But to hit as hard as possible at this stage in the war meant using the full complement of his carrier's aircraft. US Navy carrier doctrine just wasn't as advanced as the Japanese Navy's at this stage of the war. While the Japanese had extensive practice at launching different elements from every carrier's flight deck and then combining them into a full balanced strike package, a relatively fast method that allowed you to also rapidly launch follow-up strikes since no one carrier needed to launch that many aircraft per strike, it did however rely on having a lot of flight decks to hand. Conversely, the US Navy's carriers had for most of their operational lives practiced alone in an attempt to enhance survivability, as the discovery of one did not necessarily therefore mean the discovery of all. But a byproduct of this interwar training was that instead of launching, say, the dive bombers from Enterprise, the fighters from Hornet, and the torpedo bombers from Yorktown, sending them all off, and then following up with the fighters from Enterprise, the torpedo bombers from Hornet, and the dive bombers from Yorktown, and then a third wave right behind made up of the remaining squadrons, which would allow you to send in 3 successive and closely spaced waves, each carrier instead sought to launch its entire complement and then get them all going, a process that took far longer and meant that the first aircraft off of the deck would end up burning an awful lot of fuel circling waiting for the last. Fletcher, aboard Yorktown, was still recovering his search aircraft and combat air patrol, which was why Spruance took the lead in ordering the attack. Aircraft duly began to leave the flight decks of Enterprise and Hornet, and after around 3/4 of an hour, with aircraft still winging their way airborne and reports of a Japanese scout aircraft nearby, Spruance ordered the dive bombers to head off immediately. The torpedo aircraft would just have to catch up. It would be almost another half hour before the last Devastator finally rumbled into the sky. Then it was all in the hands of the air officers on the carriers and pilots in their aircraft. Spruance had given them their starting orders, but all he could do now was wait. Elsewhere, of course, Yorktown was launching her own aircraft, but with only a few spotty radio reports comprising the entirety of communication with the outgoing strike aircraft, the real measure of success or failure, and what it had cost, would only come when those aircraft came back. Unfortunately, the Chief of Staff, Captain Browning, had made a critical error which would cost the US Navy dearly. Bearing in mind that until a few days earlier Spruance had never commanded a carrier, he'd inherited his staff aboard Enterprise from Halsey, and had done what a proper admiral in his situation should do. He'd outlined the overall strategy, and then given the orders to attack. He'd then allowed the staff to coordinate the fine details. One of those details was to tell the departing pilots where their carriers would be when they got back, since of course the carriers would constantly be moving. The one place they wouldn't be was where they'd left them. Unfortunately, Browning had failed to do this. Standard procedure existed if such information hadn't been received, but this was to assume that the carriers would continue to close with the enemy. But with the carriers instead having to constantly sail southeast in order to launch their aircraft and recover combat air patrols, they had sailed in an entirely different direction, and thus the first returning strike aircraft arrived to find empty sea. Their homes were in fact almost 50 miles due east, and Browning had also failed to transmit their new location at any time while the aircraft were airborne. It was only when Lieutenant Commander McCluskey, Enterprise's Air Group commander, sent the naval equivalent of "Where did you all go?" that the pilots were finally told they needed to head east. As a result, many landed on fumes, and many more forced to ditch when their engines ran completely dry. Most of the pilots would be recovered, but their aircraft were of course gone. Also gone, as it turned out, were pretty much the entire US Navy's inventory of Devastator torpedo bombers. But the news, of course, was not all bad. Although Hornet's dive bombers had gone off on their own little adventure and found nothing, by sheer luck, the late-launching Yorktown dive bombers had arrived over the enemy formation at about the same time as Enterprise's. Each dive bomber squadron had been conducting its own search pattern, and with the Japanese carriers desperately rearming for an anti-carrier strike and a little distracted by the valiant but suicidal attacks of the American torpedo bombers, the dive bombers had quickly rendered 3 out of 4 enemy carriers into blazing funeral pyres. This left one carrier to potentially try and deal with, although all Spruance had left to him was a reduced suite of Dauntless dive bombers, as the tiny number of surviving Devastators would clearly be going nowhere fast. While recovering his aircraft, Spruance could also see the Japanese Navy's response. The surviving carrier, Hiryu, had sent out a scratch force that was even now going after Yorktown. He couldn't do much to help other than dispatch some of the ships from his own screen to try and provide support, even as Fletcher's ship sent up a huge column of black smoke. Soon it became pretty clear Yorktown was out of the game, at least for now, and Fletcher, realizing the time constraints on the battle compared to how long it would take for him to take a ship over to Enterprise, ceded overall control to Spruance. Spruance now faced a dilemma. Yorktown was still afloat, at least for now, and 3-1 was a pretty good trade in carriers, but he also knew that there was nothing to prevent that lone enemy survivor from evening the score further later on in the day. If nothing else, it could supplement its air group from the aircraft that the other carriers might have had in the air at the time, much as some Yorktown aircraft were already landing on Spruance's ships while Yorktown sorted itself out. And so the last enemy carrier needed to die as well. Of course, that meant finding it. The last confirmed sighting, by this point, had been hours ago. The ship could be almost 100 miles from that point in any direction by now if it had decided to move at full speed. And given that his own aircraft hadn't been able to find their home carrier at half that range without radio guidance, Spruance now took a calculated risk. Instead of immediately rearming everything he had and sending it out again for a chancy roll of the dice, he would instead get the last enemy carrier spotted first. This ran the risk of his own ships being spotted by Japanese recon aircraft, and a mutual kill situation might develop, but launching now meant that if his own strike missed, which was likely, then the enemy would have open season on him anyway. His forces, as mentioned, were supplemented a little by aircraft from Yorktown, which had still been airborne when their ship had been hit, and of course Hornet's dive bombers were largely fine. Yorktown had managed to get scouting aircraft away before she'd been crippled, and these were even now on their way south, even as a second enemy force was itself heading north, and that force would also find Yorktown, which had just about managed to patch itself up, and then hit her again, compounding the earlier damage. But, minutes afterwards, one of the wounded carrier scout aircraft reported it had found the last enemy carrier, now significantly closer. Spruance ordered a second attack dispatched at once, but Browning and his staff somehow managed to mess this up, and it took almost 45 minutes before the first American dive bombers headed back up into the sky, many of them the survivors from Yorktown now based on Enterprise. It was another half hour before Hornet got her bombers aloft, Browning having apparently also forgotten to tell the other carrier what exactly was going on, which had left poor old Mark Mitcher aboard Hornet exceedingly confused when Enterprise had started launching strike aircraft before Hornet was aware that they were supposed to be doing anything to attack at all. Nonetheless, the Dauntlesses were eventually airborne and heading the right way, and Fletcher, who'd reached the cruiser Astoria, confirmed that he was happy to leave Spruance in charge of matters. The dive bombers duly reported that they'd badly damaged the last enemy carrier, but now Spruance faced twin dilemmas. Ideally, Midway should be preserved in American hands. The Japanese invasion fleet was untouched, and so, under that paradigm, he should proceed west to get in a position to hit them the next day. Conversely, he also had to preserve the carriers that he still had, and Hiryu had only been around 100 miles away. The Dauntless crews reported that she had had a powerful surface escort, which remained undamaged. Thus, if he headed west, it could potentially lead to a night surface action with Congo-class battle cruisers, something his forces were singularly unsuited for. Trading a clear 4-1 victory for a potential 4-3 result, which would overall be a net defeat for the US Navy, on the off chance of getting a handful more kills the next day, really wasn't to Spruance's taste. Losing Enterprise and Hornet, and most likely also Yorktown, would leave the US Navy with just Saratoga and Wasp against an Imperial Japanese Navy that had at least 4 remaining fleet carriers of some form or another, which included the 2 Shikakus, their best ones. The staff seemed unable to come up with any suggestions as to what to do, and so Spruance decided he was going to head east until midnight, which would outrun any possible surface attack. He would then head north, and then head west again in the early morning, arriving at dawn in a position where, if Midway was under direct assault, he'd be able to offer support without also being directly in the firing line. The next day in the pre-dawn darkness, the submarine Tambor, which happened to have his son aboard, reported Japanese ships were 3 to 4 hours steaming west of Midway, and then it spotted a pair of damaged cruisers. They seemed to be retreating, but with partial information and poor flying conditions, Spruance chose to await further information. Gradually, more and more sighting reports came in and the weather cleared up, and he decided to launch an attack. This promptly led to a screaming argument between Captain Browning and McCluskey, with the latter stating that the former had turned the attack order into something which required the carriage of the heaviest bombs to a distance far beyond his aircraft's capabilities to actually return. Spruance was forced to intervene as Browning was just telling McCluskey to follow orders, and in the end Spruance sided with McCluskey, who recommended taking lighter 500-pound bombs instead of 1,000-pound bombs, and launching a little later, which would get the aircraft physically closer to the Japanese in the first place and extend their operational range. Spruance made this decision likely on the twofold basis that if anyone knew the aircraft's operating potential better than the Admiral's staff, it would be the pilots who flew said aircraft, And of course, the fact that Browning's conduct the previous day wasn't exactly reason for stellar confidence in his capabilities. The later attack was launched, but this meant the return flight finished in the hours of darkness. Many considered that the fleet should stay in the dark and remain hidden. Spruance, who already felt the loss of so many brave men from the day before, and also knowing that losing most of the rest of his remaining strike aircraft would leave the carriers as interestingly shaped floating toys, ordered the fleet illuminated to help the pilots get home. He would later state that if a commander launches an attack so late in the day that a return in darkness is likely, and the commander is unwilling to do what is needed to get the aircraft back safely in the circumstances, then the commander had no business ordering the attack in the first place. His gamble paid off. Only one aircraft failed to recover safely. Sure that the enemy was retreating, Spruance now pressed west over the following night. Search aircraft the next morning found some elements of the Japanese fleet. Hornet launched first, Enterprise following once her search planes had returned. They reported damaging a number of enemy ships but not sinking any. Spruance had 3 operational Devastators left and summoned their pilots, ordering them to go airborne, but also under strict orders to turn back if, once they'd arrived, the Wildcats and Dauntlesses had not silenced the enemy's guns. He was now painfully aware of how vulnerable the Devastators were, and he refused to throw their lives away just to try and ensure a crippled ship went to the bottom a little bit quicker. As it was, the Japanese guns were still shooting when they arrived, and so the Devastators returned with their torpedoes still aboard. A follow-up attack on a pair of crippled cruisers was launched by Hornet, and the whole thing was broadcast back to the Enterprise live on open radio, which obviously involved some rather colourful language. Spruance, not usually a fan of profanity, asked for the whole thing to be typed up with a copy for his personal files and another which was sent to Admiral Nimitz, although he did acknowledge in a covering letter that most of the transcript was probably not suitable for wider publication. Recon aircraft were dispatched to get pictures of the 2 cruisers, which had now been attacked 3 times and were refusing to sink. The quickly developed photos of the Mikuma were comforting, though. She was still afloat, but it was fairly evident that wasn't going to be a long-term status. The pilots, though, had now been flying combat operations for 3 days, and the escorting destroyers were running low on fuel. Spruance decided he'd pretty much pushed his luck as far as was reasonable, and decided to call it a day. After a quickly rescinded set of orders from Nimitz to go after the Japanese forces in the Aleutians, the 2 surviving American carriers headed home. He decided to not publicly mention the failings of the staff that he'd inherited, as he remembered all too well the way the victories of the Spanish-American War had been obscured by a very public spat between 2 officers at the time. In private, though, his trust in some of the officers on the staff was fatally undermined, and for good reason. Conversely, he'd also sadly come to distrust Mark Mitcher for a number of reasons, including loading the incorrect bombs on his aircraft in the follow-up attacks. The mistakes that Spruance noted did occur, but these events would lay some unfortunate seeds for the future. Still, he had managed to stop the heretofore unstoppable Imperial Japanese Navy, gutted the Kido Butai, reset the board in terms of number of large carrier hulls to approximate parity instead of a near 2-to-1 disadvantage, and he'd managed to preserve 2 out of his 3 flat tops. Not bad for a man barely a month into his first ever carrier command. He was now to be sent even higher up the command chain. For someone who had less than a month earlier only ever been in charge of a cruiser division, Spruance was now appointed to be Nimitz's chief of staff, and thus principal advisor. This, of course, meant that he'd barely settled in when the planning and execution of the Guadalcanal campaign took centre stage. Mindful of the stress his pilots had been under at Midway, as well as concerns that some of them had expressed, which essentially amounted to them being worried that their career options in this war seemed to be fly until you are shot down, Spruance initiated a rotation program to bring experienced pilots home for rest and to pass on their knowledge to others. Those trainees, in turn, would be better equipped to survive when they headed out, and the veterans also then got to practice on the latest aircraft ashore before being asked to operate them in combat when they cycled back to the carriers in their own turn. He also fended off a number of attempts by various officers to form small forces to increase the number of targets that the US Navy could engage at once. Spruance did not like the idea of spreading American assets too thin. He approved of the general idea of being aggressive, but insisted that the forces be made much larger, and, if there weren't enough ships to do so, then the idea would have to wait until there were. One officer protested that Spruance wanted to use a sledgehammer to crack a nut. Spruance, however, was of the opinion that fairness and war were antonyms, and simply told the man in question, "That's the way to win wars." He was keenly aware that even a small naval force might contain thousands of men, and he was not prepared to risk their lives on a gamble that would be a lot safer with a little bit more of the US's growing industrial might pushed their way. Some would thus criticise him for being overly cautious. Others, and I would count myself among them, saw a cold and ruthless logic to his actions. He knew better than most what was coming down the slipways. Better then a gradual series of gigantic hammer blows from an iron gauntlet than a rapid flurry of jabs with an open palm. Or in other words, he'd gamble, but only after he'd thoroughly stacked the deck. Outside of that, he amused himself with afternoons of walking along the beach and regular swims in the ocean, where he regularly outswam pretty much anyone who joined him, even the famously fit Admiral Nimitz. One staff officer would later recall that when Spruance realised a lot of younger men were swimming between him and the beach, in reality running along the seabed just to try and keep up, he then ordered that all junior officers should swim outboard of the Admiral, which almost resulted in a few drownings as men several decades his junior struggled to keep up. These breaks in routine were needed because the Guadalcanal campaign really wasn't going well. Although the troops on the ground were managing to hold on to Henderson Field itself, it was sometimes a close-run thing, and a series of night actions were rather rapidly eroding the US Navy's cruiser and destroyer strength. So Spruance was sent to accompany Halsey, who'd recovered, when the latter was dispatched to relieve Admiral Gormley, in whom Nimitz had lost faith. Upon his return, Spruance reflected on the state of intelligence processing and evaluation in the theatres and actions that he'd been part of, and finding this lacking, he supported Commander Layton's recommendation to Nimitz to expand the 5-man intelligence portion of the Pacific Fleet staff into the full-fledged unit known as JICPOA, or JICPOA, the Joint Intelligence Center Pacific Ocean Areas. That department was to prove invaluable in the years to come. As 1942 drew to a close, Halsey's relentless aggression and the rapid adaptation of US Navy surface forces, partially thanks to the brutally Darwinian process that was sailing in Iron Bottom Sound, and partially thanks to a number of key players becoming involved who happened to be some of the best at what they did, like Admiral Lee, began to stabilise the Guadalcanal situation and then push back the Japanese on land and at sea. It didn't come cheap. The carrier Wasp exploded when she was torpedoed transiting between safe and combat areas of the Pacific. Spruance's old subordinate Hornet was sunk, eventually, by the Japanese following one of 2 fierce carrier battles in the Guadalcanal area, and his command at Midway, the mighty Enterprise, had seen so many chunks blown out of her that she was more patches than ship at this point, and that's just the carriers. But overall, the balance was coming back into their favour. With the British HMS Victorious on its way to help USS Saratoga hold the line, and the promise of many more ships, including crucially fleet carriers, currently in their fit-out stages, Spruance was able to take some leave to visit his family back in the mainland USA. Upon his return to Hawaii, his next task was to help Nimitz plan the next phase of the war, offensive action against Japanese holdings. This was a complex task. The combined chiefs of staff needed convincing, and that meant convincing US Admirals Leahy and King, as well as US Generals Marshall and Arnold, plus their British counterparts, to all agree to something, since the resources needed for a major offensive would significantly affect the resources that would be available across the rest of the world's fighting fronts. In and of itself, this might have seemed near impossible. But, of course, there was an extra spanner in the works. General MacArthur. whenever wasn't he? Having been deflected from his previous attempts to Leroy Jenkins the nascent US amphibious forces into Rabaul by the outbreak of the Guadalcanal campaign, he was now preaching against the US Navy's favoured strategy, which was, of course, to take various island groups and isolate major Japanese overseas bases where needed, in favour of a grinding land campaign, which, of course, would be under his command, to first retake the entirety of New Guinea, which, naturally was a trifling matter to occupy an island which had a surface land area approximately as large as the entire territory the Allied forces would eventually need to seize in the advance from the D-Day beaches in Western Europe to when they met up with the Soviet forces in the middle of Germany. And then, this small task accomplished, they would immediately go for the Philippines, presumably on the understanding that the Japanese garrisons on the various Pacific islands and the big bases like Rabaul and Truk that sat between this axis of attack and the entire US infrastructure, up to and including Pearl Harbor, would of course simply stand aside and allow minor matters like logistics and troop convoys to pass completely unmolested in recognition of MacArthur's obvious brilliance. By March 1943, Halsey's fleet was about to sail into the parts of the Western Pacific that technically were demarcated as MacArthur's responsibility, and so a conference in Washington was arranged to work out how exactly they were going to move forward with the operational command dispute, both specifically in Halsey's case and more generally at large. Spruance was dispatched by Nimitz to advocate for the US Navy with a threefold plan. He was to underline why MacArthur's plan wouldn't work, he was to advocate for the naval island hopping approach in general, and also to argue that they should clean out the recently lost Aleutian Islands in particular. Spruance quickly found common cause with Admiral King, who laid the groundwork for Spruance's arguments by commenting early in the conference that he would be unwilling to bog down the Pacific Fleet as a support element for a major, months or possibly years-long land campaign where the Imperial Japanese Navy would have the initiative to attack at a time and place of their choosing, in a year when the US Navy could not actually guarantee local superiority or even parity with the Japanese forces 24/7. Although any amphibious attack bound the fleet to defend a fixed point to a certain extent, a large landmass like New Guinea drastically limited deployment areas compared to small islands whose surface area was essentially negligible, and campaigns on the atolls and such like would be over far faster, which would deny the Japanese Navy the luxury of time to work out the schedules, routines, and thus potential weaknesses in any US Navy operations. Additionally, a more Central Pacific approach limited Japanese counteroffensive opportunities, whereas locking most of the frontline fleet into the Southwest Pacific would in theory leave the Japanese Navy with a largely free shot at going after Pearl Harbor again, as by the time they sailed from Japan, it would be physically impossible for a fleet based off of the coast of New Guinea to catch up. The overall result of the conference was mixed. Nimitz was allowed to go after the Aleutians, and MacArthur was definitively restrained to limited operations in the Southwest Pacific region, but the overall direction of strategy remained somewhat up in the air. While Spruance headed back to Hawaii to help sort out retaking Attu and Kiska in the Aleutians, the Joint Chiefs of Staff eventually announced in summer 1943 that their strategy would be to attack in both the Central and Southwest Pacific. But the bulk of US Navy assets remained under Nimitz's command and thus could be directed at the central push, with the first target being the Marshall Islands. Spruance was now tasked with coordinating the efforts to plan this invasion. The situation was tricky on paper. The Japanese Navy would be able to defend with support from interlocking land-based airfields, and the overall carrier fleet strength at the time was roughly equal in hulls. The US had Saratoga and Enterprise from the pre-war fleet, and the newly arrived USS Essex and the Essex-class Lexington, with the promise of the Bunker Hill and the Essex-class Yorktown coming later in the year. There were also 3 of the Independence-class light fleet carriers to hand, and more on the way. Against this, the Japanese could muster Shikaku and Zuikaku, their own pre-war survivors, the converted Hio and Junyo, although the former had just been sent back to port by a torpedo hit, and around half a dozen smaller conversions, although none of these were as capable as an Independence, but they could still send a few dozen aircraft into any given fray, and of course they had more of their own carriers under construction as well. Spruance was left fending off numerous plans, many somewhat optimistic, including one which called for the US forces to be split into 5 distinct formations to go after 5 different islands at once, something which seemed to almost gift-wrap the rebuilding US naval forces to the Japanese Navy in small, bite-sized packages. He eventually realised that without any decent reconnaissance information of the Marshall Islands' defences, and the need for an initial seizure to work as both a ship and aircraft base, going straight for the Marshalls just wouldn't work. Instead, they should take the nearby Gilbert's Islands first. This would allow them to stage to the Marshalls. These islands were close enough to existing US bases for recon flights to reach them. They would provide valuable experience for US troops conducting opposed landings without exposing them to the undoubtedly heavier fire of the Marshalls' defences, and the islands provided both sheltered anchorages and space for airfields. This would turn into Operation Galvanic, initially tabled as the seizure of the atolls of Tarawa and Nauru. Of course, with new ships streaming into the fleet, someone was going to need to helm the US Navy's Great Offensive. Nimitz headed east to confer with Admiral King, and shortly thereafter, dispatches to Hawaii revealed that Spruance had been promoted. Vice Admiral Spruance, complete with 3-star flag, he was going back to sea to lead the first major US seaborne offensive of the war. So, no pressure, really. He quickly began assembling a staff from men he knew and trusted. Critical to all this was Captain Carl Moore. Spruance knew that he himself could envision strategy, but translating a goal into the 1,000,001 detailed orders and dispatches was not his forte. Moore, on the other hand, he knew, was a master of detail. Moore was thus also assigned to pick up the rest of the staff, with the exception of the flag lieutenant, and soon the fleet was being assembled, at least on paper. It was a mighty force as well. When you considered the size and power of some of the new ships, it actually outgunned the entire pre-war US Pacific Fleet by some margin. And while it formed up, Spruance toured the Allied-held parts of the Pacific region, familiarising himself with local commanders and some of the troops that he would be in charge of getting to their destinations. Spruance's subordinates soon came to the conclusion that the Joint Chief of Staff idea just wasn't going to work. Tarawa and Nauru were too far apart for the US forces to support both areas at once if the Japanese Navy came out to play and they wanted to keep the fleet together, which therefore would risk defeat in detail. And Nauru was several hundred miles closer to the Japanese base at Truk than Tarawa was. Spruance agreed, and he lobbied Nimitz and then King to get things changed. And in this he was successful, with King persuading the Joint Chiefs of Staff to swap out Nauru for the rather closer Makin Island. His staff worked tirelessly over the next few months to get everything ready. Spruance wanted the assault to be as fast as possible, as there was a good chance the specific targets would catch the Japanese by surprise, but the longer the fleet lay off the islands in close support, the more time there was for the Japanese to plan an optimised counterattack strategy. However, unlike some of his aviators, Spruance did not want the fleet to wander too far. He saw the carrier's role in supporting the ground troops as just as important as their role of destroyer of Japanese warships, and so he wouldn't countenance leaving support range of the islands. Instead, he decided his carriers would launch an assault on the appropriate Japanese air bases nearby right before the landings commenced, which hopefully would destroy or tie up most of the nearby land-based Japanese bombers for a while. The carriers would then hightail it back to Makin and Tarawa, allowing the initial landings to proceed in relative peace. It turned out that Captain Moore was one of the best staff officers Spruance could have picked. Although he'd been passed over for flag rank, Moore had at one point been a superior officer, or at least a contemporary to, most of those who were now flag officers in the Pacific region. So despite now being their junior, he was largely unfazed by all the gold braid. And he also insisted that everything that was distributed to the fleet be as clear and plain as possible, often rewriting technically perfect but also perfectly technical plans from the rest of his staff so that more than 5 people in the entire fleet actually understood what on earth they were being told to do. Finally, in November 1943, it was time to go to sea again, and for his flagship, Spruance chose not a battleship or a carrier, but the heavy cruiser USS Indianapolis. His reasoning was simple. He wanted to be able to relocate the flagship to wherever he thought it was needed at the moment's notice, or where the fighting was fiercest. This would massively disrupt flight operations if he was on a carrier, and a battleship had a very specific role in the fleet screen, or later in the bombardment groups, or if the Japanese battleships came out to play, on the front line. Indianapolis, by contrast, could be useful pretty much anywhere. She was fast, and if his desire to be on the front lines managed to get the ship badly hit, it wouldn't weaken the overall fleet strength all that much. Although time had seen even more ships commissioned into the US Navy since planning had begun in the summer, recent struggles in the Solomon Islands had seen 5 carriers and their escorts redirected to that area to assist Halsey's campaign. If they weren't back in time, Spruance planned to seize only Tarawa in the initial assault, and then move the entire fleet over to take Macon. If they were back in time, both islands would be attacked simultaneously. The carriers lent to Halsey returned to the fleet while it was actually en route to its targets, and a few days later the preliminary strikes on nearby Japanese airfields began. Then, on the night of the 19th of November, under the cover of darkness, a massive fleet made a rush over the horizon to surround the target islands. At dawn on the 20th, red flares rose into the sky, and the Japanese defenders, massively outnumbered, awoke to find the sea seething with a whole range of ships, a lot of whom immediately began to open fire on them. Smothered in explosives from ships and aircraft, it seemed that there would be little the Japanese could do to resist, and indeed the carpet of shore bombardment fire was causing massive casualties. But, as the landing craft went in, the LVTs, the landing vehicle tracts, were making good progress when the following line of Higgins boats suddenly all ground to a halt. A neap, or low tide, meant that the usual tidal predictions were completely wrong, and a large portion of the assault force bound for Tarawa was now stuck at a coral reef far from the beach. The LVTs pressed on, as they could go up and over the coral, but with the first assault wave thus much reduced, the Japanese defenders who'd survived the bombardment were able to concentrate their fire, and the landings quickly dissolved into the grinding chaos that was the Battle of Tarawa. Macon Island, on the other hand, turned out to be much less heavily defended, but the army units that had been assigned there were inexperienced, and so they took the same 3 days to take that island as the Marines took to bludgeon their way across Batio, the main island of the Tarawa Atoll. There wasn't all that much Spruance could personally do once the fighting ashore began, other than order his ships to keep up supporting fire, which did help. A massive banzai charge was stopped in its tracks, in part thanks to a pair of US Navy destroyers opening up in support of the Marines with pretty much every gun that would reach the island. And the Japanese command and control network suffered an early blow when a naval shell from the bombardment killed the garrison commander and most of his staff as they prepared to relocate. In the end, the islands were both taken, but at a terrible cost. In 3 days of fighting, almost 2,000 US soldiers and sailors had been killed, and many more wounded, and over 3 times as many enemy had been killed, the latter making up almost all the Japanese garrison, with the small number of survivors being mostly the survivors from Korean labour gangs. But no sooner had the guns fallen silent than Spruance had to go back to Pearl Harbor to begin planning for the next assault. The Joint Chiefs of Staff had requested that the Marshall Islands be under the Stars and Stripes by the 1st February 1944, barely 2 months after the last shots were fired on Tarawa. The lessons that had been bought at great cost there would have to be quickly absorbed into subsequent planning, for as bloody as Tarawa had been, the planners feared the Marshall defences were much, much greater. And so, as 1943 turned into 1944, Spruance prepared for round 2 of the Great US Central Pacific Offensive.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.